Welcome to the LBD Live podcast, Conversations Shaping Responsible Military Innovation.
Hello, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining the first Lawful by Design live podcast, shaping conversations around responsible military innovation. So my name is Damien Copeland. I'm the Director of Article 36 Legal, which is an Australian-based international law practice that aims to bridge the gap between industry innovation and national legal review processes. Now, the Lawful by Design podcast is part of our broader Lawful by Design initiative, which promotes IHL compliance as part of responsible innovation in the military. And this podcast is designed to provide an interactive forum where participants can ask questions at the end of a discussion by experts. We aim to take about 40 minutes for the panel discussion and then have 20 minutes for questions at the end. Those that ask questions in the chat will only be identified by their first name. And this podcast is being recorded and will be loaded on the Article 36 Legal YouTube channel. In addition to this podcast, the Lawful by Design initiative includes a number of other programs. The 30 by 30 program, which seeks to encourage more states, 30 states in total, to establish national legal review processes by 2030. We have academic and student ambassador schemes. We're running a series of industry workshops and conduct training both for industry and national lawyers and policy advisors. There's more details on those aspects of the Lawful by Design initiative on the Article 36 legal website. So welcome to our panel of experts, Dr. Zena Assaad and Professor Nehal Bhuta. Dr. Assaad is a senior lecturer at the Australian National University's School of Engineering and is formerly a research fellow in the Australian Army Research Centre and Trusted Autonomous Systems. She's also a member of the Expert Advisory Group for GC REAIM and a Lawful by Design ambassador. Her research explores the safety of human-machine teaming and the regulation and assurance of autonomous and AI systems with a focus on military applications. Welcome, Zena. Professor Nehal Bhuta is the Chair of Public International Law at the University of Edinburgh and the co-director of the Edinburgh Centre for International and Global Law. He is a GC REAIM Commissioner, working on the strategic guidance report that will identify short and long-term recommendations to governments and other stakeholders on topics connected with AI in the military. Nehal's most recent edited volume includes autonomous weapon systems, law, ethics, and policy. And we're delighted to have you here with us today. Welcome, Nehal. So let's commence the panel discussion. Our topic today is a thought-provoking question that goes right to the heart of responsible design and development of military technology. The question that Zena and Nehal will consider is, what is a socio-technical approach to design, and why should lawyers understand how to work with one? So we'll start with the first part of our question. What is a socio-technical approach to design? Zena, when I think of design, I naturally think of engineering. So could you start by providing an explanation from an engineering perspective of what a socio-technical approach to design is? Thank you.
Absolutely. And thank you for having us on the podcast today, Damien. So socio-technical design is actually, it's really interesting, especially if you consider its origins and how it started. So in the 1940s, there was a group that came out of the Tavistock Institute in London who were tasked with researching why people were leaving the British coal mining industry at the time. And this was post-World War II, where we were seeing a lot more mechanization at the time. And what that mechanization did was it changed working conditions for people. So people were leaving the coal industry for jobs in factories because the working conditions were better. And so a research project that was supposed to start around trying to understand why people were leaving a particular industry and how they could attract people back to that industry actually ended up giving birth to this idea of sociotechnical, because what they found was that because of increased mechanization and the ways that we were using technology at the time in ways that we hadn't seen before, there was this very strong interrelated relationship between technology and society and the way that technology exists within society. So when you think about socio-technical design, you have to think about it from that perspective. We don't talk about technology in isolation of the way that technology actually is implemented and exists within society. And so from an engineering perspective, socio-technical design is about thinking about technology, thinking about the accuracy, the precision, the efficiency of technology, but it's also about thinking about those things in the context of how they will be used. So this is where we start getting into things like safety and legal requirements and whether or not they actually do or don't benefit people.
Thanks, Zena. Nehal, what does international law have to say about socio-technical design from a regulatory or other perspective?
Damien, and thanks for having me on. So at one level, the short answer is nothing at all. Right? The concept of socio-technical design is not a term that international law has anything directly to say about. But I think in the context of the technologies that we are talking about, particularly their military uses, which are regulated by international law, international humanitarian law, it seems to me that the socio-technical design dimension is going to be absolutely fundamental to being able to answer the question, can we use these technologies in a manner that is compliant with international law? So let me just unpack that a little bit. Right? So as Zena's pointed out, the idea of socio-technical, or the concept of socio-technical, is that the human and groups of humans who are societies, or form small societies, large societies, that the social is not completely separate from what we think of as the purely technical, whether it's idea of code, whether it's idea of hardware, whether it's particular kinds of technical innovations. In the end, when we bring a technical innovation into use in society or into a social activity, which includes warfare, what we're really evaluating is the relationship, right? The interrelation between the humans and groups of humans, the organizations that they sit in, the institutions that make them, that shape them. You know, as a former military officer, you know that you've been shaped by a military institution in ways that take quite a long time to actually explain to somebody who's never experienced that. That whole reality of human social existence is you cannot simply disassociate that and separate out the interaction with technology as a purely technical matter. So my basic point, and this is a point that I've been working on in relation to your topic of interest, Article 36 review, is particularly in relation to the evaluation of artificial intelligence enabled means methods of warfare. It's not enough, it can't be enough to ask a strictly technical question, which is, what are the technical parameters, or what are the technical metrics by which we could assess the performance of this particular capability in relation to artificial intelligence. I think it's true of everything, but in relation to artificial intelligence in particular, we're actually asking, how do we understand the relationship between the human and the machine here in a way that allows us to evaluate lawfulness? So going back to your original question, Damien, short answer is the concept of socio-technical is not known to international law, but my point would be that understanding the socio-technical is something that international lawyers, international humanitarian lawyers who are concerned about evaluating lawful behavior and lawful action using this technology have to come to grips with in ways that maybe we can start to unpack in the next 45 minutes. I think you're on mute, Damien.
Thanks, Nehal. So by the sounds, we're talking about a concept of considering technology from multidisciplinary perspectives and from a design that considers the human, how it human interacts. And I guess from a legal perspective, where that machine or artificial intelligence performs roles that engage legal obligations that are upon the human users, then I can see the importance of that consideration from a design and development perspective. So that takes us to the second part of this question. Why should lawyers understand how to work with a socio-technical approach? So Zena, again, from an engineering perspective, I'm interested to hear from you and your experience in safety in human-machine teaming, why lawyers actually need to understand this approach.
So I'll build on a little bit more from some of the points that Nehal was making. And one of the really interesting things about particularly AI-enabled systems in a military context is that we're seeing these technologies integrate in a way that we haven't seen them integrate before. So if we specifically look at this through a socio-technical lens, so the way that technology is implemented in the context of different social contexts, this particular technology is being implemented in a way that impacts people in a way that we haven't seen before. So these systems are data-enabled systems, and the way that data is collected and the way that data is contextualized and the way that it is used and the way that it is interpreted is impacting people in different kinds of ways than other technologies. And this is the really interesting part about the socio-technical lens for AI-enabled systems, particularly in a military context. We're having these unique complexities that are coming out that we haven't seen in other technologies. So for example, we see a lot of biases that come out in these particular technologies. And so when we think about this through a safety lens, and particularly a socio-technical safety lens, we start to look at safety in a way that is different than just physical safety. We start to look at different kinds of harms, psychosocial harms, harms to your privacy. There are different kinds of harms that we're looking at in a way that we haven't before. And as a safety engineer, this was a really challenging thing for us to consider because we were starting to look at things that were difficult to quantify and difficult to capture. When we look at technologies and we look at how we make them safe and how we reduce risks as low as is reasonably practicable, a lot of the times we do that through numerical or quantifiable ways. And so now we're seeing these kinds of technologies where it's a lot more nuanced and it's really a lot harder to kind of capture those safety and risk considerations. Why I think it's important for lawyers to be looking at this socio-technical lens and understanding a socio-technical lens, particularly in this context, is because even before we were seeing more AI-enabled systems in the military context, we always had a very strong relationship between safety and the law. And as a system safety engineer, when we were going through those kinds of processes, a system that wasn't legal wasn't deemed safe. And so that relationship continues with AI-enabled systems in military contexts. But I think the tension point here is what I was talking about before, which is around these kinds of risks and harms that are essentially intangible in a lot of ways. And so it's important for lawyers to understand that socio-technical lens and try and understand how we capture, and maybe this is something that Nehal can, a thread that Nehal can pull on a little bit more, but how do we capture these more intangible risks and harms for these kinds of technologies? I have some ideas of how we capture them from a technical perspective, but I know a lot of my colleagues who come from different disciplinary backgrounds disagree with a lot of the ways that engineers want to deal with these kinds of problems because they view these problems from a very different perspective.
Absolutely. And of course, there's the traditional problem of language, interdisciplinary language between lawyers, engineers, others. So, Nehal, you mentioned before the conduct of legal reviews, and of course, from a military perspective, lawyers conducting legal reviews of AI-enabled systems, including AI decision support systems and autonomous weapon systems. How do you think a socio-technical perspective or approach can be incorporated within a legal review process?
Thanks, Damien. I think that's a very good question. I think I wanted to build on something that Zena said. In order to just first of all show in a non-AI system what's the relationship between safety and law, right? Because obviously, we're all very preoccupied with this new emerging technology and how it's going to change or not change what we do. But I think it is important to appreciate that the way in which most modern militaries develop and procure systems already rests on what we might think of as a socio-technical approach. Right? It may not be called that, but it's, as you know, somebody who's conducted lawfulness reviews of military systems. When we do these things, the lawyer gets a kind of technical brief, and the technical brief explains the performance dimensions of the system, and you as a lawyer then look at those performance dimensions and say, well, on that basis I can conclude that this can be used in a manner which upholds distinction. I can put some caveats on how it shouldn't be used, and that legal articulation rests on a kind of output from the safety engineering process. Now, the first point to make, which is about where we are now, which is the existing safety process actually does rest on socio-technical evaluation already. Right? So there's nothing radically new there. Is a system safe to use from an engineering perspective, as Zena points out, builds in the question, can it be used in accordance with the legal requirements that we have established? So it's already there. So the technical report that comes to Article 36 reviewer is already a report that asks the question, do we understand ourselves as having achieved the requirement of safety, which includes the requirement that in order to be lawful, it should do this and not that. Okay. The challenge, or what we need to do, I suppose, in my perspective, is lawyers in your position, lawyers who've had your role, perhaps have to be able to now appreciate in a deeper sense and in a more elongated sense the ways in which the system has been built in order to meet certain requirements, and to have a role in shaping those requirements much further back in the process of the system. And so for that reason, I think you might say the challenge of AI-enabled systems for legal review is not that they are socio-technical, whereas a guided missile system wasn't. The guided missile system was also socio-technical. That doesn't change. It's that lawyers have to confront the socio-technical problem, in my view, in a much more engaged way. They have to become technically more literate, but they also have to be involved in helping shape the relationship between the human and technology from the very design process, which is why I think it's very appropriate that you've called your initiative lawful by design. I think lawfulness by design is a challenge, a distinct challenge for these kinds of technologies, and lawful by design means lawyers grappling with the socio-technical aspects of technology. So let me just give you one example about what that could mean in the context of AI. It's commonly observed that certain kinds of artificial intelligence, whether it's a decision support system or something that is making forms of recommendation, generates outputs from inputs. The inputs, as Zena said, is a wide diversity of data that maybe previously couldn't have been processed in these ways to yield insight. But the novelty of the technology is that we're taking a whole bunch of stuff that maybe was just not really susceptible to processing. We've processed it and we're making inferences from it to make a recommendation. And it's got multiple layers of processing, right? Speech to text. Text is put in context to give it meaning. The meaning is understood as having a certain consequence for whether something is, let's say in a most dramatic sense, a target or not a target, right? You can say multiple layers of social interpretation built into the technical process, right? And then the question becomes, can we rely upon this? Is this a good system for the purposes of IHL? And my basic point is the lawyer cannot really reach that conclusion based on a kind of simple numerical quantitative target, accurate, not accurate. What we know about these systems is, yes, they learn. We don't always understand how they learn. Because we don't understand how they learn, we can't fully understand how they go wrong. And so we've got a kind of a process of trying to triangulate the meaning of performance. Right? What's good enough for a lawful, from the perspective of law. It's not going to be a single digit. It's going to be an understanding of the integrity of the data collection process, of the way in which it's being dealt with in the process of inference, the nature of the model, and the way in which the human interacts with the outputs of model. Each one of these things is going to have a consequence for the way in which we reach a conclusion. Yes, we can rely upon this subject to certain other kinds of confirmation, right? So that whole pipeline, which starts very deep into the ground, as it were, in the development of the technology, has to be understood, first of all, as socio-technical. There's nothing straightforward in terms of, oh, well, that's just a question of mathematics, or that's just a question of pure engineering. And in order to be able to reach conclusions about it, there's got to be a way in which the lawyers have had a role in constructing the framework for maintaining its lawfulness and the lawfulness in use, right? So from that perspective, lawyers are, in my view, are going to have to be co-producers of the technology for certain kinds of situations, safety critical situations, if we're going to have some confidence about lawfulness.
So thank you. You both made some very powerful points. So firstly, I couldn't agree more with your points around the need for lawyers, and for that matter, other experts, to be involved from the very start of the design and development of a system, so that the socio-technical aspects and their impact on law, on safety, can be included from the earliest of stages. I think your words "deep into the ground" are very apt, and so this process, particularly of a legal review, that in one sense the legal obligation can be satisfied under Article 36 by a single review at one point in time of the life cycle of a system, but that's not enough. And so I think I think your points around lawyers need to be co-producers are quite accurate, and certainly from our perspective, the Lawful by Design initiative has two elements to it which seek to achieve exactly that. It's one, encouraging industry from the very conception, design and development of technology to consider what the IHL and international law risks and implications are of the particular system, but also in parallel encouraging defence, MOD, DODs who are acquiring this technology to actually require evidence of that research and development at the very start of a procurement process, so that it is not considered late in the acquisition of a mature capability. So we've just got time for one more question. And so this is a question to both Zena and Nehal. So how can research and design of military technology in a practical way consider social, technical requirements and outcomes?
From my perspective, I think there are three key things. The first is promoting interdisciplinary initiatives. Interdisciplinary work is by no means new, but I would say that it is incredibly critical for the current state of technology that we're seeing being developed and the ways in which that we're seeing it being implemented and applied. So interdisciplinary initiatives, interdisciplinary research, interdisciplinary work. The second one is understanding that technology is at its core a human construct, and so a lot of the complexities that we see stem from human complexities. So Nehal and I both spoke about data and the way that data is interpreted and the biases that come out of that. A lot of that comes from the way that the algorithms are designed and the inherent biases that we put into these systems. And then the last one is remembering that these systems don't exist in a vacuum. when these kinds of systems are developed and they're put out into the world, they exist within existing ecosystems. You know, in the military domain, there are existing ecosystems. You have not just soldiers who are using these systems, but you had, as Nehal pointed out, broader legal requirements, broader regulatory requirements. There are existing ecosystems that these technologies need to be embedded within. And so it's important to remember that they do not exist within a vacuum.
I guess I wanted to make two observations here, and this is something which I think it's important to think about. So, I've spent the last 2.5 years working as a fellow with the Defence Science Technology Laboratories in the UK, and that gave me interesting insights, more than I previously really had in any way, as to the way that the technologists think about law and the way that the lawyers think about technologists. And my key conclusions from that experience was there's something of a dialogue of the deaf between these two communities in some way. Right? So the technologists understand the law as a set of discrete requirements, a set of rules. Tell us what we have to design for. Right? Should it go 20 miles an hour? Should it go 40 miles an hour? What's the legal requirement here? How much space should it give between this aircraft and another aircraft? These are the technologist will often perceive law as discrete and concrete obligations that can be shaped into the system. The lawyer, on the other hand, who looks at a system coming to her or him at the end of a process, is asking a more all things considered question. All things considered, taking into account how we know this might be used, what we might assume about the people using it, is it lawful? And they tend to assume, on the other side, that the technologists can tell them exactly how it's going to perform and under what conditions. And I think in the case of this technology, those two sets of working assumptions that have been to some degree plausible with previous technologies may not be plausible in the same way anymore. And so what that means, first of all, I think, is a closer requirement for we talk about interdisciplinarity, but I think what we really mean here is a better sense of co-production in the development and adoption of this kind of technology. It is distinctive. It's not radically new in that sense from an engineering perspective, but it requires perhaps more emphasis on the co-production at earlier stages in order to assure legality, right? Where the technologist and the lawyer sit down and understand together what is our concept of operations, what are the hard boundaries we need to draw around this first, because those hard boundaries would be clearly unlawful. And then within that space, what are the range of possible constraints that we might need to shape the system in order to keep it within a zone of lawfulness? And then what other things do we need to build into a way that the system is authorized and permissioned to stop particular kinds of misuse or to constrain? We can never always stop misuse, but constrain. So it's a kind of narrowing set of circles which the lawyer has to be involved in helping draw those lines with the technologist. So I think it's going to involve a lot of mutual learning to the degree that I think is probably not true of technologies as the current technologies, non-AI technologies as they're currently developed. That's my experience. It may not. Maybe there are counterexamples. So the second really important point I think here is we need to be developing approaches that give us a sense of satisfaction that we've assured this well enough. Right? That one of the key challenges of AI technology, and Zena can speak more to this than I can, is that it's actually very hard to apply system safety requirements to it in the way that they are currently framed. Right? It requires adaptation. That means that our framework for reliability, our framework for performance, our framework for justified confidence in how it's going to behave may not actually meet the benchmarks that we would want to apply to other kinds of safety critical systems which don't use the technology. Now, it doesn't follow from that it's inherently unusable. It means we as human beings developing a technology that's going to be used on us and by us have to develop frameworks as to what is safe enough, good enough, and how that's adequate or not for the purposes of law. So the second point of co-construction here, which I think is really important, is we're co-constructing the not the legal rules exist. We're co-constructing the content of what we think is a good benchmark or standard or a set of behaviors that, in our view, fit the rules. So we're kind of remaking the law from inside in that process. And I think that's something that we have to grapple with even as lawyers.
Thank you. Again, both made some excellent points. Common is this recognition, which I completely agree with, is this the need for interdisciplinary initiatives, and that should be occurring as early in the production. Nehal, I think co-design is a really nice way of describing that. I think your point also, your second point around what we're doing now is not necessarily adequate. Our assumptions that we apply, particularly in a legal review context, we make assumptions as to the legality and based on what we know that the human operator will do, because that's their training, and we know that we can. There are legal consequences if they don't, perform in a lawful way, but that assumption doesn't apply to a machine, to an AI or a machine, of course. So I think in terms of the design, both of you made these points about that this needs to be deeply embedded into the development process, which I think is very well made. So we're just about time for questions and answers. So it's been a fascinating discussion, and I think the case for socio-technical approach and considerations in the legal review and development of AI and autonomous systems within the military has been very powerfully made. Thank you. What I'd like to do now is turn to the question and answer session, and so those attending have got the opportunity to write questions. I can see Caroline has put one into the chat already. So in instances where lawyers are entering the conversation late in the research and development cycle, do you have recommendations for approaches to ensuring safety and lawful design?
Maybe I'll have a quick response to this, but I'm very interested to know what Zena thinks, actually, as well as somebody who's been involved in design processes as an engineer. I mean, I can just tell a bit of an anecdote, which is, I think, again, my experience has been that, first of all, lawyers don't tend to see themselves as having to worry about those things. Their problem is, how do I apply the legal principle here? And just tell me how it works, and I'll tell you whether it's lawful. Okay? So they see themselves at one end of the process, I think, instinctively and by training. But at the other end of the process, I think there is the risk that lawyers are seen as the people who come along and say no, that they stifle innovation. And so you don't want to get them involved too early, because they'll just tell you all the things you can't do, and they won't help you figure out what you can do. Now, I don't think that's a fair characterization, I think, but it is really something that I've heard said. And so I think the critical point is partly in changing the way in which we have expectations across these disciplinary groups in particular contexts. So I think in the military context, it seems to me that there has to be a process of teams that at the outset incorporate legal thinking, but also have a sense of what are the legally relevant considerations, even in the way that we design the concept here, right? And that's got to be part of the initial dialogue. And of course, in some cases, that will mean the lawyer says, no, you can't do that. That will be unlawful. But the lawyer also says, well, okay, but if you don't do that, maybe you can do something like this, which is going to make a contribution to a better, a more lawful outcome, right? So, or you can constrain the system in a certain way. As long as it does this function well, it's going to be okay, right? So those sorts of considerations have to be brought in very early on. And I think it also means that two kinds of convergence are needed, right? So engineering experts, designers, technologists need to start to appreciate not just what's the law, but what is the place of legal expert judgment, right, in dialogue with their technical expertise. That has to be part of the process. And lawyers need to obviously be upskilled in their ability to understand and translate what's being told to them and reflect it back to the designers in ways that help shape the technology. I think that to me is probably a very important dynamic. I think there's a real risk. There's always a real risk that tens or hundreds of millions of pounds or dollars are invested in developing something which cannot be backward engineered. And it puts the lawyer at the last instance in a very difficult position to say no to that, right? Or it means that things may well be authorized or accepted as capable of being used in ways that may not really be adequate or appropriate, or might involve quite a shifting understanding of what we're willing to accept. I think that's a risk we need to guard against.
What I'll add to that is, Nehal, I agree with you that it's not a correct characterization of lawyers that they come in just to say no, but it actually is correct that that is the sentiment, that people do view lawyers as the people who come in and say no. But what's interesting to me is they're not saying no for the sake of saying no. They're saying no because that is the answer to the questions that are being asked. And so this idea of lawyers coming in at the point of, at a later point of the development life cycle, I think it's Damien, you've said this really quite well. You say that, the idea of being lawful or being legally compliant is something that has to be embedded in the process, not something that has to be tacked on. And often it is the case that it does get tacked on because lawyers are engaged much further down the track because, as you said, Nehal, people view them as the people to say no. So I think there's actually a cultural change that needs to happen on both ends. There's a cultural change that needs to happen of people who are a part of the design process, understanding that lawyers may say no, but their job is not to say no unnecessarily, right? Like if they're saying no, it's no for a reason. And especially with these kinds of technologies in this particular context. So engaging lawyers earlier is a lot easier. And then there's also a cultural change on the lawyer side as well of understanding their relevance at earlier stages of the technical life cycle. There's this idea that we do things in siloed ways, but that's actually not accurate. An interdisciplinary approach across the entire life cycle is what is needed, not just for these kinds of technologies, for other technologies as well. And so I think moving away from this kind of fragmented and siloed approach and having a more ingrained approach across the life cycle is what's going to be necessary.
So I think if I might add, Caroline, there's some very practical things you can do. I agree with both Nehal and Zena that traditionally lawyers are seen as an innovation impediment, and I guess in many ways, in the traditional development of military weapon technology, that bullets and bombs, you could sort of get away with that to a certain extent, but not the case with technologies performing autonomous or enabled by AI. But there's some simple things you can do. So training within your organization, even basic training on laws of armed conflict. Many of the conversations I've had with companies developing autonomous systems starts with we don't know what the laws of armed conflict require, and so training would be a good first step. And also the realization that in many cases, because of the ignorance, there's a natural or hesitancy or reluctance in terms of the design. And so in some cases, the law actually permits a far greater design scope than what was being contemplated, simply because they're not aware of what in fact is required. So I think the worst case scenario is what I call TRL snakes and ladders. So technology readiness level is nothing worse than being at a mature level and only engaging the legal at folks at TRL5 and then going down the snake to TRL2 because you have to try and retrograde some sort of legal requirement. A legal review process traditionally will have one of three outcomes: lawful as intended, lawful but restrictions on intended use to mitigate identified legal risks, or simply unlawful, not to be used. And so the most likely scenario in a capability that's AI or autonomous that gets to a legal review stage without a great deal of legal co-design, as Nehal, I'm going to use that, Nehal, puts it, that the second category of recommendation is most likely in that, it will be permitted to perform some of its functions, but some of them there will be guardrails put around it to limit how it's used in operations. So thank you for your question. I've got another question that I was sent earlier. AI systems such as ChatGPT warn users that they can make mistakes and that they should check the information. How can a socio-technical approach ensure a military commander understands what a system can and, more importantly, cannot do?
I think a socio-technical approach is a different lens to look at how technology is embedded into our society. And that's what helps us understand what technologies are and are not capable of. A lot of the times we look at these things through quite a binary lens, and we look at technology in a very particular way, and we don't really look at it in the way that it is actually integrated into our society. And so from the perspective of ChatGPT, yes, it does provide you with a warning saying that, some of these outputs are incorrect, but that warning wasn't originally part of ChatGPT when it was first released, and it became part of ChatGPT afterwards when people were making decisions based on incorrect outputs from ChatGPT, and it suddenly became, lo and behold, a legal issue. And so this is an example, right, of had lawyers been consulted a little bit earlier on, this was probably something that would have been embedded from the beginning, where when you use ChatGPT, immediately you had the T's and C's on the bottom that says, some of these answers may be incorrect, but that wasn't the case when it was originally released. When it was originally released, it was, lo and behold, this amazing, accurate large language model that we've produced. And so because we looked at these things through very siloed lens, we looked at ChatGPT as a technology and we looked at law as law, they didn't really come together until a problem became a problem. And so I think what's important for us is to bring these things together, and what the socio-technical lens does for us is it removes that fragmentation, that kind of binary lens, and brings these things together to have more foresight and anticipatory approaches to these kinds of technology instead of reactionary ones, which is what we saw with ChatGPT.
Yeah, thank you.
A few words to that. So I think I agree with everything that Zena said, but wanted to pick up and maybe dig a little deeper on this question of, so in the context of civilian use, the harms are real, and they can be quite grave. But in some respects, within the legal standards of liability that apply, we might accept that they can be mitigated after the fact by forms of compensation. You shouldn't have released this without a warning. You are responsible for that harm, but it doesn't mean that the technology is unlawful, but you need to then encase it with this process by which you give people a choice to understand, or you give them some warning that says you shouldn't use it in this way, or you need to be aware. I mean, I think there is something quite distinctive about the military context because of obviously the criticality of the risk, the risks to life in using this, which in a way which is feeding into potentially the use of force, means that it's a potentially extremely severe risk at every use if it's wrong, or if you're using it in the wrong way, or you're relying on it in the wrong way. But secondly, if you combine that with the idea that one of the reasons militaries want this technology is to be faster at making decisions, which is really what they want, then the scale of harm can be magnified immensely. So you have severe risk and then severe risk of harm at speed. And this poses a real problem. It's not the kind of situation, I think, where we would be quite happy to sit back and say, well, let's see how people work with it and try to, fix it a bit later, adapt to it a bit later. I think this poses a risk from a legal perspective for states who are under the, under the Geneva Conventions, obliged to respect and ensure respect for their international humanitarian law, of which Article 36 is a part, where if you could foresee that it's a regular pattern, or it can be expected that humans might rely excessively on outputs that are inconsistent or inaccurate in ways that are difficult to predict, then, and that if you put that into theatre, you're going to have lots of humans interacting with that under situations of extreme stress where they themselves may feel that threat. The foresight here is evident that it could result in conduct that is violative of the laws of war. So I think the socio-technical perspective here has to take that into account. It's a different interaction with the technology in a different context from, the civilian who's trying to figure out, can ChatGPT tell me how to invest my money, right? There's harms there, and those harms could be significant, but the socio-technical approach says, okay, but this technology for this use case, with these people who we know are likely to use it in that context, that means we're going to have to take a different approach. It's not enough just to have a little warning that flashes up there. Could be wrong. Don't rely on me, because actually you're in a context where people are under so much pressure and stress and threat, where you actually want them to be able to rely upon it, because you don't want them to hesitate too much. And that means building in a whole different way of assuring the relationship between the human decision and the technology. So I think that, to me, is a great example of how the socio-technical lens gives you a very different approach to both design, but also to the problem of where you situate the law in the process. I think in the military context, you want to be bringing the law in much more ex ante as a constraining and shaping device.
Thank you. Excellent points. I guess one of the underlying philosophies behind lawful by design is that the law is built in, not bolted on. And I guess an observation is that the legal review process is as part of a broader responsible development framework are national processes, which means that the law doesn't specify how states undertake their processes. And it's entirely open for a state to incorporate a broader legal review lens that goes into the design and development to inform how that development can comply with legality, make a determination, and then continue in a governance perspective throughout the life cycle of a particular system. So we're almost out of time. So I think we'll wrap up. Thank you so much, Zena and Nehal, for a wonderful discussion. I've certainly learnt a lot, both in preparation and during this podcast. It's been fascinating, and I think there's a lot more that we can discuss in relation to a socio-technical approach to the development of military AI. Thank you very much for the attendees. It's great to see that there's interest in this topic. Good to see my colleague, Dr. Alistairs, online as well. Thank you. So this live podcast is scheduled every second Thursday at the same time. Apologies to my US friends, but it is recorded, so you are able to see it at a more respectable time of the day. This will be available on the Article 36 Legal YouTube channel in the next day or so. Now, our next podcast is on the 28th of August, and this is a pre-laws GGE edition, where we will have experts, a panel of experts speaking about what the key priorities, likely hurdles and potential outcomes are of the second session of the Laws GGE, which is scheduled for the first week of September in Geneva. So once again, thank you everybody for joining us this evening. I hope you've found this interesting, and I look forward to inviting you to further podcasts in the future. Thank you.